This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Welcome to this debate, is the United States in decline? My name is Ewan Morgan. I'm the head of the US program of the Institute for the Study of the Americas. Since I'm participating in the debate as a speaker, I'm not going to chair it, but I would just like to say a few words. You may think that this debate grows out of the Obama State of the Union address, or before that the Kagan article which appeared in the New Republic, but I confess it comes from low culture. I got the idea out of the Ides of March movie, where George Clooney in the last slide says, presidential candidate, I'm going to make America #1 again, implying of course that America was now #2 and therefore proving our point in this debate. But I'm sure that there are many people who dispute whether America is in decline. You'll have the opportunity to put your fourpence worth in after the speakers have finished, but I will now hand over to my colleague Matt Hill of ISA, who is going to be the neutral chair in this debate. So Matt.
Okay, do you want me to? I've been told that I have to go up here to... First of all, thank you so much for coming. It's a great audience and I hope we're going to have a really lively debate from the 4 people here. I'm just going to do a few outlines. The first thing is there's a sheet at the back which, if you could put your name and email address on, is a key part of our mission to promote and facilitate the research of others, and this is one way in which we do that. In order to measure that, we need people to actually put their names and their email addresses on there. So if you could do that, we'd really appreciate it. First of all, just to let you know the format of tonight, there's 4 presenters. Each one's going to have an opening address of about 15 minutes. I will obviously, after 12 minutes, I'll do a 3-minute warning. Then what we'll do after that is we'll have a 50-55 minute Q&A session. And I'll outline this a little bit later as well, but just to let you know, what we'll do is if someone asks a question, and then we'll get one from each of the sides to respond, or potentially all of them to respond, or you can direct a question specifically to one person. That's fine. There'll be no follow-up questions, so it'll be a question, there'll be a response, and then there'll be another question. If you want follow-up responses, then please afterwards in the reception. The way that the order of it is, also what we're going to have is at the end, Adam and Mick are both going to speak for 2 minutes and to sum up their arguments. And then at the end, what we're going to do is have a vote with you guys with regards to whether or not you think the US is in decline.
You don't ask that.
I think the word's vox pop comes to mind. Educating vox pop. And then finally, just to let you know the order, Adam will be talking first, then Mick will be talking. So Adam's arguing that the US is in decline, Mick is arguing that the US is not in decline, then Ewan will be supporting Adam's statements, and then Nick will be supporting Mick's statements. Okay, thanks very much. That's your cue.
Okay, that's my cue. Clapping here, not myself, by the way. Just to be clear, don't worry. Excellent. Well, thank you all very much for coming. I feel a bit like President Obama and myself with this level of attendance. Hopefully less partisan in tone. Obama, in his speech the other day, was good enough to notice that anybody who says that America is in decline or that our influence has waned doesn't know what they're talking about. It's always good when a public figure engages with your arguments directly or indirectly. So I felt warmed to the cockles of my heart when I heard that. We're also told that he's become terribly impressed, as was alluded to by Ewan, with Robert Kagan, the American right's favourite pretend historian. who, as an architect of the project for a new American century, is of course author of such previous predictions as regime change in Iraq will reinforce American values and further its interest in the Middle East. So some reason for skepticism there. Also the author of Dangerous Nation, which is essentially the argument that the United States was founded as a nation of aggressive, acquisitive, crypto-imperialists, and since it's always worked out so well, why would we think about doing something like changing? But when it comes to Obama, I think we also have to say this is a president who said that, for the reasons we can imagine a president might, but who also acknowledges that the Chinese economy overtaking the American economy in size within the next 10 years is, quote, inevitable, who is to preside next year in the first cut in American defense spending within a generation, who wants to draw down American commitments in other parts of the world in order to put resources into the priority area, which is Asia, and who has declared that operations remotely resembling Iraq and Afghanistan are off the table for the foreseeable future on the grounds of cost. So when a politician's words and a politician's deeds separate and go in different directions, I ask you who you're going to believe. When it comes to that choice, I think I will always go with deeds rather than words. President Obama is somebody who is reacting to and adjusting to the reality of the fact that America's declining power in the world is on the table as his agenda to deal with. He is not somebody who I think in any meaningful sense, as we're about to outline in the course of this argument, believes that the United States can sustain its position at the degree that it has been over the course of the foreseeable future. The argument for decline is a simple one, which can be evaded, which can be caricatured, but the central truth of which cannot easily be countered. The point is simply this: relative to other nations, the power of the United States within the foreseeable future is going to become significantly less than it has been. It will have a smaller share of the global economy. It will therefore have a smaller military budget relative to all the other military budgets in the world, and the military capacity that results will therefore be smaller compared to other nations than it has been. This is an argument that's been made by many people before. They have on certain occasions in the past turned out to be wrong, and therefore there is a line of argument that says this has been wrong in the past, therefore why would we believe it now? We're the boy who cried wolf in some ways, the people who argue that American decline is coming. But lest we forget, at the end of that story, the wolf really did come. So I think on this occasion, we should take this rather more seriously than analysis simply based upon past precedent suggests. Ewan is going to go through some of the economic numbers for us in the course of the second talk, and I will leave some of that detail to him, but suffice to say the headline concept is basically this. There is a fiscal crunch facing the United States, whereby in the short, medium and long term, the US government is spending billions, cumulatively trillions of dollars that it simply does not have, by any analysis, conservative or extravagant, coming in the door at any point within the foreseeable future. The gap between outgoings and incomings is massive. This means that simply to maintain current levels of spending on issues of national security, the United States will need hundreds of billions of dollars of year-on-year cuts in terms of other spending priorities like healthcare, like social security, like domestic priorities. If you believe the United States is able to make those cuts and transfer all of those funds to new national security programs, then you believe America can resist the trajectory of relative decline ahead of it. If you do not believe that that is possible, then I simply put it to you that it's impossible to sustain the thesis that America will not decline in relative terms. That is why it's currently the task of Leon Panetta, the Secretary of Defense, to find over $400 billion of cuts in the Pentagon's defense budget, while the Chinese military budget, by comparison, is growing by more than 10% per year, 13% last year. For those who understand the concept of compound growth, what that basically means is that year on year the Chinese military is going to be growing, it's going to be drawing closer to a US military budget, which is declining over the course of the same time, in both absolute and real and relative terms. Within 10 years, China, by the US's own predictions, will have what it describes as a modern military, equipped with the new J-20 stealth fighter, which is in design. It will have its own built aircraft carriers, in addition to the one it's already put to sea, which is an updated Soviet craft. It's also developing new weaponry, such as aircraft carrier killer missiles. Anti-satellite strike capability has been tested in the last few years. Cyber warfare techniques are in the pipeline. Simply to stand still in the realm of military strength, you need to do an awful lot in terms of investment. The United States' capacity to sustain its level of investment at the level of superiority that it currently exists over a rising power with China, with an ever larger share of economic world size to devote to the project, is not going to prove remotely possible. less money to spend on the military, and also less to disperse in terms of aid, and also a smaller share of the international economy, simply means that the United States is going to steadily affect others with less disproportionate scale than they affect it. At the moment, the United States moves, and the world is affected vastly more than the world in turn can affect the United States. As others rise, and the United States, even if it simply stands still, the United States' actions become less disproportionate in their effects. It becomes one among a number of major powers. It is no longer the defining power shaping the world. And this, by my definition, by most definitions, is relative decline. And it's the story of our generation which is going to unfold before us. It's the fun of debating that you get to engage in a degree of preemptive clarification and rebuttal. And that's what we're going to do. First of all, by talking about what we're not talking about, and then by talking a little bit about why some of the arguments that I strongly suspect are coming our way may be wrong. First of all, we are not saying the United States is going to disappear tomorrow. It's not going to fall off the edge of the earth and cease to be. The United States may well stay where it is in terms of some of its spending. I doubt it. It's going to fall to some extent, I think. But even if it stands still, even if it remains a major power in the world, which it will, if other powers are rising, spending more at a faster rate, growing in their capacity to sustain that, then its relative position will decline. The United States will remain a very powerful country for a long time, but another country, or maybe more than one other country, will rise relative to it. Second of all, we're not saying that another power like China is going to become the replacement for the United States, dominating the world in the same way as during the unipolar era the United States did. Other powers will clearly remain powerful relative to it. A world of many powers of varying levels is what we're talking about here. Not someone taking over the shop as the unipolar daddy of the world, as it were. Thirdly, we're not saying the United States has already declined. We're saying that this is a process which is going to be ongoing, which has begun but is yet to unfold. Reeling off a list of the United States' advantages relative to other countries today is a snapshot that captures where we are today. What we're arguing is that over the course of time there will be a steady shrinking in that advantage. We're not saying that America isn't ahead today, we're saying it can't stay where it is today relative to others indefinitely. And we're not saying that the relative decline of the United States is a cause for celebration necessarily. Robert Kagan will tend to introduce many discussions of this topic with the idea that we should all be careful what we wish for. The world led by the United States may seem unpleasant sometimes, but a world led by China or India or Russia isn't necessarily a world we want to live in. Well, that's all very well and good, but things that we don't want to happen sometimes have a way of happening anyway. So we need to separate out in our minds the idea of whether we'd be happy with a world in which the United States is going to decline from the question of whether that is the world that is going to come about. I would say that the second point is more important, and the second point is the point that we're arguing for you tonight. And finally, what we're not saying is that America is necessarily declining in some kind of quasi-spiritual or moral sense, falling in on itself as a collapsing society. The United States may well be able to react in a mature, sensible, balanced way. It may be able to regenerate its own domestic politics, difficult as they clearly are at the moment, to deal well with decline, to decline well. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be able to sustain its relative power position compared to other nations measured in the terms that I've just set out, and that is what this conversation is about. In response to the declinist case, which is what I've just said is often called, there are certain arguments that tend to come one's way. These are pretty familiar. You may well hear some of them tonight. One is that it's dangerous to predict from current trends. We know what things are like at the moment. We know the direction they're going in. Saying the world will definitely be like that can be dangerous. By present trends, I will have talked for 17 hours by 17 hours' time. But that depends on when you start measuring and what you think is going to happen. What you think is going to happen next. But despite the fact that other things may happen, China may fall apart, the United States may have some equivalent of the IT revolution again that we can't foresee. As social scientists, present trends are the imperfect best we have. You look at what's happening now, you look at what it would mean if that continued to happen, and unless something that we don't know about yet comes along and changes it, the future is what you predict based upon those trends. I would ask you, what is the bolder thing to do? To claim that present trends will unfold until we arrive at some future point based upon them, or to speculatively suggest that present trends will reverse themselves and that something totally different will happen? It's possible that you're right, but I think whilst betting on an outsider may well win you the money at the end of the day, I'll stick with the favourite, thank you very much. And as a social scientist, present trends, whatever their flaws, are probably the best way of going about working out what is going to happen. Another thing that one hears is that China may well be becoming the biggest economy, may well be becoming the biggest military spender, but that won't make a difference because its per head figures are lower. China's bigger, more people, therefore it's not going to be able to have the same standard of living for its own citizens within the same period of time that we're talking about it taking over the Earth as the biggest economy in the world, which is within the next 10 years. That's fine in terms of measuring the living standards of individual citizens, but in terms of military spending, it is absolute size that matters. If per head military spending was the issue, Saudi Arabia and Oman would be the hegemonic powers of the world. China is a bigger country in absolute terms, and it can have the biggest, best army in the world for a much smaller GDP per head because of that fact. So I think if you're going to argue that the United States is not going to be able to take it in military terms, the relative argument does not get you terribly far, because per head military spending is a very strange measure of very little meaning, I think, when it comes to these sorts of things. A third argument that one often hears is that the United States has soft power appeal, that it can outlive the loss of its hard power, or perhaps that it has some kind of structural or agenda-setting power, some nebulous ability to control the world's events that goes beyond the relative power that it's acquired over the course of the years in more raw and material terms. Maybe. But ask yourself this. Did the United States develop the ability to attract others and persuade them of its agenda and nudge the world to go along with what it wanted to do, independently of its being richer and stronger than all of the other powers in the world? Or do these things have some connection with one another? While perhaps one is even dependent to some extent on another. If and when another state, ask yourself, has the largest economy in the world, thank you, Matt, has the largest economy in the world, and one of the largest militaries in the world, if not the largest, will it simply assume prerogatives of the United States remain the same, or will world order with Chinese characteristics or some other set of characteristics be part of the agenda that it wants to pursue? I would strongly suggest that sustaining a structural agenda-setting advantage in the absence of the dominance of real power is a very difficult task. The United States may well assume that it can succeed in that, but it's very much a jury is out scenario as far as I'm concerned. The United States has many advantages in terms of the cultural appeal that it has and its network of institutions. With good strategy, it can use those advantages to make sure it declines well, preserves a lot of influence for itself that it otherwise might if it goes down fighting. But that's essentially an argument about how well you manage your decline. That is not an argument about how you can prevent your decline from happening at all. And finally, you may hear that all of this is old hat. Who cares about such trivial matters as states increasing their military spending by tens of billions of dollars a year, building cutting-edge fighter jets and aircraft carriers, when states don't really matter? Great power rivalry is over, war's yesterday's news, and in a world where liberal order reigns and nuclear weapons deter superpower conflict, why bother thinking about such things? To that I simply ask two things. If national advantage and military power are meaningless, then why is the world's rising force investing hand over fist in its effort to build up its military capacity? Why is it that powers throughout that region are changing their behavior in response to seeing this? And why is it that the United States is already describing its strategy in terms of pivoting its resources to this region in order to address this desire to increase power on the part of the United States? Second thing I want to ask, if national status built on cash and power projection no longer matters, why do we care so much more about China than we used to do? Does it make no difference that China is unveiling new plants around the world for industry, new military bases are planned? Does it make no difference that a new building for the African Union has just opened in Ethiopia, built by Chinese money? Does it mean that in issues like Iran and its nuclear weapons program, we care no more about China's views today than we would have done in 1990? I would say probably not. The reason we do care more is because states matter, what they spend on military things matters, the resource share that they have in the world matters. And if you agree with all of those statements, then the relative distribution of resources between them matters, in which case we do have to argue the United States, or do have to see the United States as in decline. Otherwise, it's a terrible misunderstanding upon which the entire world seems to be behaving, and while I would regret that, I do not believe it to be so. To conclude, ladies and gentlemen, you will hear many things coming from the other side of this debate, which are interesting, accurate, intellectually sophisticated, and yet fundamentally serve to distract you from the central point of this issue. I submit to you that the meaning of decline is that the United States will over a period of years become relatively less powerful compared to other nations, meaning that its disproportionate ability to affect others more than they affect it will shrink, and this will be because it will have ever smaller superiority in terms of the economic resources, military capacity that it possesses. This is decline, properly defined, and it is unfolding as we speak. There may be qualifications, there may be caveats, but there is a simple truth. For better or for worse, At a speed and a manner yet to be determined, the relative power of the United States is in decline. And if you accept that, you accept the declinist premise. Everything else is detail, everything else is a debate for another day. And that's why I commend this motion to you. Thank you very much.
Tough act to follow. Tough act to follow. If I can get out of here. But then I'm in decline as well. And I love my Adam Quinn. Former PhD of mine, you see, they're all good.
I love
So too. Firstly, thanks to Ewan for organising this. Thanks to the Institute of the Americas. And thank you for coming along this evening. I was in Florida over the weekend, and I suppose that would be another argument for decline. Look, we've been here before, Adam said that. I call this the decline debate 3.0. I said the United States was in decline at about 1972. I knew it was true, because I said it was true. Paul Kennedy said it was true in 1987. He added that fatal chapter in the book on the rise and fall of the great powers. And 2 years later, what happened? Paul Kennedy seemed as if he was barking mad as the wall came down. But this time it's for real. Decline debate 3.0. Now, I've had an odd relationship to this discussion for many years, because at times I have indeed argued something very close to what Adam has just suggested to you. Actually, as the debate has intensified and as the consensus, which I think Adam more represents, actually, outside and inside the United States, as it's intensified, given my contrarian nature, the more I've kind of interrogated this argument, and the more I think that it contains some very, very serious flaws indeed. I mean, in terms of Adam's definition of decline, then we can all accept that. I mean, 1945, the United States controlled what? 70% of the world. 85%, thank you very much. The empiricist in the audience. I don't know facts. But 85%. It had a monopoly of atomic weapons. I mean, so in some general sense, you can say it's in decline. I mean, but that's not really the debate, it seems to me. It's the question is whether the United States is going to remain, in relative terms, obviously decline. I mean, that's a weasel word, relative, it strikes me. The question is not that. The real issue, it seems to me, is whether the United States has certain characteristics and structural power, to use Susan Strange's term, which he used many years ago in this debate on decline, in the early 1980s, whether it possesses certain advantages, gives it certain exceptional qualities, which means that however much the rest are trying to catch up, they won't do it. Or however many problems the United States confronts, and however maybe mismatched its capabilities are to policy, it still retains some fundamental structural advantages which give it an importance in the international system which no other state has played and can play or will play. And whether or not within that system the United States is still perceived and understood, even by some of its key rivals, as being a central part of keeping that system going. I even would take the argument further on the question of China. We have a completely confused debate about this going on at the moment, particularly after the financial crisis. But when you talk to many of the most senior Chinese people, which I've done occasionally when I go to China, which is an important way of thinking about China, in a slightly less worried way than Adam, the consensus it still seems to me is real. That those who talk about American decline in the way in which Adam has talked about it are just plainly wrong. In other words, the key rival to the United States, those who actually think long and hard about running this country, 1.3 billion people, when having to make the key decisions about the future of Asia, the future of the world, and China is a very important component part of that, nonetheless, even they arrive at a conclusion which is rather different to yours, Adam. They say, well, yes, there are those who believe there's an American decline, people like Adam Quinn and Bob Kagan and other influentials around the world, but we are not banking on that. And so it's interesting to take even the greatest rival to the United States, if one regards China purely as a rival, which I don't, by the way. I see it's a rival and strategic partner, is both. to see what they say about this. Now, this time it's for real, and we're crying wolf and the wolf turned up. We know it's for real this time because we've got an economic crisis. We didn't have that before. We have the rise of the rest, China. Costly wars without victorious outcomes, Iraq, Afghanistan. The debt, which Ewan has written about so well, and the followers, we are told by Barry Buzan, a good colleague of mine at LSE, are in short supply. This time it's for real because Paul Kennedy says it's true. As you say, you get it right 20 years later. And of course Paul, who I admire enormously as an historian of Anglo-German relations in the 19th century, is now back on the same argument. I mean, 20 years later he's got it right. Even Neil Ferguson, who worked with me and alongside me, insofar as Neil works alongside anybody, in our centre at the LSE. Neil was great fun to have around. I love contrarians, and you don't get much more contrarian than Neil. But Neil, of course, who was kind of celebrating the American empire and just telling people in 2000 that, get real, you are an empire, the problem is America wake up to the fact you are one. 10 years later, I mean, he's gone Spenglerian on us. The West is collapsing, it's the end of the world, the Columbian moment started in 1492, blah, 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 blah. So there's a lot of Spenglerianism around. Adam is not Spengler, but there's a lot of it around at the moment. And it also, I think, situates itself within a certain sense of a lack of confidence in the West. The notion of the West. What the West is. So I don't think it's just a question about America. I think there's a larger question here which reinforces this argument. That somehow or another there's a power shift underway which is, broadly speaking, moving economic power, the balance of forces, away from the West to something called the East, or even towards Asia, the rise of the rest. So there is this sense, I think, of that something fundamental is taking place, within which, of course, one of the most fundamental changes is this re-emphasised debate on American decline. But as I said, as the debate has become more intense, in a way I've become more contrarian towards it. And maybe let me express at least 5 very sceptical thoughts there. Adam preempted everything, so basically what I'm doing is repeating Adam. Well, firstly, actually, Adam, you slightly lightly skated over the issue. We've been here before, but this time it's for real. Well, we have been here before, and I'm not sure there is such a qualitative difference now to the previous debates about American decline. I mean, after all, the setbacks and defeats in Iraq and the problems confronting the United States and Afghanistan, the $3 trillion war and all that, yes, has it eroded some degree of self-confidence for the United States? Perhaps. Has it cost a lot of money? Definitely. But boy, I was around during the Vietnam War. And if you think Iraq and Afghanistan have proven problematic for the United States, you should have been there, as I was outside the American Embassy in 1968. I do apologise to you all. No, I don't. Over the Vietnam War. I mean, if you think the rise of a new rival is a problem in terms of the... Well, actually, the Soviet Union was a pretty important rival to the United States during the Cold War. I mean, maybe an overestimated one, as we found out. Later on, people said, it was always bound to collapse. I never believed that. But that was a serious rival, not to be underestimated. America now has fewer followers. Well, yes, that's true, but you should have been around when Ronald Reagan was there in the early 1980s. Even Mrs. Thatcher criticised him a couple of times. So there are new things going on in the world, Adam. I do accept that globalisation, the rise of China, and of course the debt, which I no doubt Ewan will talk about. But I'm still not convinced that this is such a qualitatively new moment that it means that we should jettison the lessons we've learned from the previous debates about decline. We've been there before. America overcame those problems for important reasons to do with the United States. And therefore I'm not entirely convinced at all that it can't do it again. Whatever set of problems it is doing. There's a high level of determinism, if I might put it, in your argument. And I think that is part of the problem with the kind of determinist, declinist argument. Politics matters, and the nature of America matters, and the nature of the system, which we call the United States, matters. Which brings me on to the crisis. The crisis is a new factor, there's no doubt. The economic crisis is a new factor. It wasn't there in the 70s, although there was one, but it wasn't like we have now. And it certainly wasn't there when Paul Kennedy was writing his book at Yale. Nonetheless, and here's the equivocation, it seems to me we have to distinguish between an economic crisis which is real, which has cost a lot of jobs, which has done damage to the American model. All of that is true. One has to distinguish between that and some of the fundamental structural strengths of the United States. In other words, to use a kind of cliche, one has to distinguish between conjuncture and structure. And it seems to me still, and the crisis hasn't changed this, and George W. Bush didn't change this, and Obama probably isn't going to change it either. There are certain fundamental structural strengths that the United States possesses. Economists write about it, even economists at the LSE write about it. Innovation, relatively low levels of corporate tax, immigration keeps labour costs low, and immigration itself. The United States is still a hugely popular point of destination for peoples from around the world. Declining countries don't attract millions every year. The poor, the dispossessed, the rich, the wealthy, the highly qualified Indians, and by the way, the highly qualified Chinese, who are all desperate for a position in Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, maybe, but also Cornell, Harvard, and any other American university they can get into. That doesn't seem to me a sign of a declining system when you're getting the situation at the moment where tens of thousands of middle-class bourgeois Chinese parents are desperate to get their kids into Cornell. Or if they don't get Cornell, Arizona State will do. This does not, it seems to me, indicate the kind of decline that Adam is talking about. And when you, I mean, again, I can only give my own personal thoughts on this, my own observations on this when I go, and I'm not saying because I go to China, therefore I know, I don't. But just talking to, what I call ordinary Chinese parents and members of the Chinese elite, they still have the hugest regard for the American capacity for innovation, renovation, economic renaissance. The kind of perspective Adam has represented here tonight, very skillfully, with Adam's typical rhetorical skills, I never found at all in China. The admiration for the American model is huge. The belief that the United States can regenerate is just great. And that just tells you something. The rival actually thinks that its rival, the United States in this case, actually still has a very, very long way to go. And anyway, if it didn't have a long way to go, I wouldn't be sending my kids there. Of the top 100 universities in the world today, over 75% of those are still American. Of the top 100 business schools in the world today, 80% of those are still American. More Nobel Prizes come out of American universities than any other single country in the world, and that is not going down. These are indications of some strengths. And these are not strengths that China possesses, by the way. And these are not strengths that Brazil possesses, or Russia possesses. If you look at the BRICS, there's this famous conundrum, this peculiar phrase dreamt up by Jim O'Neill, a Manchester United fan. Therefore, everything else follows. I'm Arsenal, therefore don't feel sorry for me. Brazil, how many universities in the top 100? 0. Russia, none. India, none. In the top 100 universities. China has 5, 3 of those are in Hong Kong. These are also signs of power. Soft power, cultural power. They're important. Let me, because the time is up, now, I've been as wonderfully polemical as Adam has. Let me just say something then about China. Because that is really a large part of what this debate is about. I think. It's partly about the crisis and the impact of the crisis. It's partly about the Bush legacy and what people think that G.W. Bush legacy is. But it's also largely, I think, about the rise of China, the peaceful rise of China, and long may it remain so. Look, I can only say the obvious, and I'll simply repeat the obvious. China still has an enormously long way to go. I mean, the Goldman Sachs projections I find entirely unbelievable, frankly. And it is a purely quantitative measure. There's so many things that doesn't measure in terms of quality, in terms of all the sorts of structural problems that China faces. If you like, America is a settled system. China is not. And China does face a fundamental problem. And the Chinese leadership don't know how to handle this one. The fundamental contradiction, if I can use an old Marxist phrase, which Ronald Reagan also used, by the way, in a speech to the British Parliament in 1982, there is a fundamental contradiction between the base and the superstructure. You know, you have this dynamic, effectively capitalistic economy, or state capitalist economy, within the framework of a communist system. And you know, ultimately, I think that is going to run. That's going to run into that's going to fill some shocks, and you can see that in the insecurity expressed by the Chinese leadership recently. Moreover, while China certainly is, and I'll conclude on these quick points. While China clearly is asserting itself, particularly in Asia, and you can see it in Africa, Latin America. Nobody denies that. 1 million Chinese people now work in Africa. It's interesting. No dispute there. No dispute there. I would still argue, though, Adam, that I think China is still playing and operating within a system which it accepts, broadly speaking, is still going to be shaped by the United States for a very, very long time into the future. For a very, very long time into the future. Indeed, its own rise has been dependent on the United States. This has not been an independent rise. It began in the 1970s. It accelerated in the 80s and the 90s and has gone hell for leather over the last 10 years. But it's still very much within a system shaped by the United States. And I still think the United States has enormous veto power in the relationship with China. Now, of course, it's reverse dependency. I don't dispute that. But I still think within this system, China's rise is still being contained. Indeed, the paradox of China's rise is this, and this really is a problem for China, it's not a problem for America. Count your enemies and count your friends. As an old friend of mine used to say to me, Mick, you don't have enough enemies. I thought I had enough already. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, look, judge anybody by friends and enemies. How many allies does China have in the world? Answer, 1. Who? North Korea. That tells you something about the appeal of the system. That tells you something about global reach. That tells you something about international power. For all of the statistics on China's growth, which is impressive, it's taken a lot of people out of poverty, that is for the good. Nonetheless, its main ally, indeed it's only, and it's not even a very good ally, it's not a dependable ally. Would you like an ally like North Korea? No, of course not. America still has a capacity, which you have to think about, Adam, in terms of to attract, to pull people into its alliance system. And indeed, within Asia, which is rising, China's rise within Asia is actually compelling more and more Asian states closer to the United States. So China's rise itself has this reverse effect on China's position of power. The Vietnamese, who fought long and hard against American imperialism, are now the most pro-American when it comes to the strategic relationship. And again, that must tell us something about the ability of the United States, not just to attract, but also to play that kind of global role that nobody else can play, and nobody else wants to pay for. I could say many, many other things. I won't on the military gap. I think that is huge. I don't think America, by the way, is imperially overstretched. It's still spending a pretty minor proportion of its budget actually on national security, about 4 to 5, even less. The only thing I'd end on, I suppose, Adam, is this. Many years ago I met Walt Rostow down in Texas. And he said to me, do you know this man Kennedy? And I didn't know Paul Kennedy then. And he said, well, I don't like Kennedy. And I said, well, have you met him? He said, no, but I've read this rubbish he's been writing in 1987 on the rise and fall of great powers. He said, terrible book. And then he came up with this great title of an essay he then wrote as a riposte. He said, beware historians bearing false historical analogies. And I think that's a very good way of concluding, because I think so much of the debate about the future of American decline is because we think that all great powers must, by definition, rise, mature, and then decline. And I think that's a false historical analogy, and I hope it's one we will resist here this evening. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much. as the only non-international relations specialist here, I'm not going to try to match my fellow speaker's erudition in that field. I'm going to concentrate on a field which I know a little about, not a lot about, but a little, which is economics. And I happen to think that economic power is fundamental to geopolitical power. This isn't determinism. Dare I even say that history supports it, but that's historical determinism, we're told. But I'm going to quote the very man who will prove my point. Ronald Reagan, the patron saint of anti-declinism. He said in his memoirs, talking about the severe economic problems enveloping America when he became president, Reagan said, "No problem the country faced in 1981 was more serious than the economic crisis. Nothing was possible, i.e. in terms of winning the Cold War, unless we made the economy strong." I could rest my case here, but I will continue. Now, it's no coincidence, I would argue, as a mere historian, that American global power was at its peak. Well, the American economy was also at its peak. A strong and growing economy generated the buoyant tax revenues that funded America's hard power in the form of its huge military from World War II to the present. It was also the foundation for America's soft power and its ability to promote free trade values in the international economy. In contrast to the economic success story of the 20th century, however, America faces a much more constrained economic future in the 21st century. Now, at first sight, this statement may seem contentious, since America's share of nominal global GDP is the largest of any nation at around 25% of global GDP. And it also, its own gross domestic product is roughly twice as large as its nearest single country rival, China, in 2011. Only problem was that 10 years ago in 2000, US GDP was 8 times as large as China's. In the ensuing decade, China's economy grew on annual average by 10.5% in real terms, compared to America's 1.6%. On current trends, therefore, China's GDP, I know this is an aggregate term, but I think it's important, China's GDP will eclipse America's on a purchasing power parity basis in 2016, and far more importantly, in dollar terms converted at market exchange rate, Chinese GDP will eclipse America's in 2018. It isn't going to take a decade, it's going to take less than a decade. Now, anyone wishing to compare China and America as economic rivals should visit The Economist's China v USA website, as I did to do this talk. Now that must read journal for political elites and intellectual elites like Mick here is in no doubt that the United States is in relative decline. Now, to signify this, in last week's edition, The Economist began a weekly section devoted entirely to China. The first time it has singled out any nation since it began detailed coverage of the United States in 1942, symbolically the very year that Henry Luce, the owner of Time, pronounced the arrival of the American century. Well, if we're not in for a Chinese century, we're in for something that isn't the American century, according to The Economist. Now, you might say, what, so what? You might say the United States still has 133 firms in the Fortune 500 global list of top companies, twice the number of China's. However, if you want to choose indicators, I can choose my own to support my own case, and I'll choose these. The US has already fallen behind China in steel consumption, 1999, exports, 2007, fixed investment, 2009, and very importantly, in terms of inventiveness and technological expansion, patents granted to residents in 2011. The US is still ahead, if only just, in retail sales, stock market capitalization and consumer spending, but current projections suggest the lead will change hands on all these indicators in the next 10 years. And finally, China will outstrip the US on the ultimate index of hard power, in other words, defense spending, in 2025. Now, of course, these might be wrong. I might be Cassandra, Paul Kennedy, whomsoever. No, Cassandra was right. I might be Paul Kennedy, okay? Now, America's upward strength, America's economic strength was always on an upward curve in the 20th century. Why should the present century be any different? The answer is that the United States has to grapple with the problem of economic rebalancing that China and other emergent economic powers do not face. Now, the crisis we've heard a lot about. I think the crisis is less important than the long-term structural problems that have been hidden for too many years. Now, the United States, we hope, I certainly hope so, will achieve cyclical bounce back from the current crisis. But that's not going to resolve the structural weaknesses that have been slowly eroding the foundations of American economic strength for a quarter century. In essence, the United States has relied too much on internal consumption and debt, both private and public, to drive its economic growth from the 1980s through the first decade of the 20th century. The real renewal of America's economic strength requires a rebalancing of its economy to focus more on saving, investment and exports. But this will be very difficult to pull off, because everybody else is trying to do the same thing. That's one reason for that. But you might say, well, the United States still leads in key economic sectors, particularly knowledge-intensive capital goods. But only about 4% of all American firms and 15% of its manufacturing enterprises do any exporting at all. And just 1% of American firms account for 80% of America's total exports. This is not a country whose companies are driven by exports. It relies heavily on internal consumption and private borrowing to fund that internal consumption. Now, US exports of goods and services, it's not simply about manufacturers, it's also about services, made up just 10.9% GDP in 2009. For economic rebalancing to occur, a lot of economists, respected economists, not economists from Monkey like myself, estimate that the export share of GDP will have to double in a decade in order to put economic rebalancing on strong foundation. And that is a very tall order indeed. Now, if the United States is to achieve economic rebalancing, the state will have a very important role to play. This is not going to come about as a result of the market. The state will have to play a role. In part, this will be through greater public investment in all levels of education, in worker training, environmental safeguards, and infrastructure improvement, all of which are needed to enhance America's competitiveness and productivity. More significantly, economic rebalancing requires the national government to put its finances on a sustainable basis for the medium to long-term future, so that credit is freed up for productive investment in the private sector. Now, a fiscal course correction will have to await a stronger economic recovery. It's foolish to attempt it now. The recovery isn't strong enough. It would flatten the recovery. But sometime in the middle of this decade, the United States will need to take action to do two things: to control entitlement spending, that's Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid in particular, and to boost taxation revenues in some way. Without such a course correction, the Congressional Budget Office, which is a neutral organisation, it hasn't got a political axe to grind, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that the US public debt ratio to GDP will in 2023 surpass its historic peak of 109%, which it reached in 1946 when the United States was still paying for World War II. The United States is not paying for a war at the moment. It's paying for its vast borrowing since the 1980s. And the situation will get even worse the longer it's allowed to go on. By 2035, approximately, the CBO calculates the GDP debt ratio will hit 185%. In those circumstances, legally required entitlement spending and interest repayment would increasingly squeeze out the availability of tax revenue for other programs. This would leave the US government entirely reliant on borrowing to finance essential programs like defense, education and infrastructure. But to do this, interest rates would have to go sky high to tempt nervous investors, treasury security purchasers worried about the sustainability of America's debt. Now, the current state of intense political polarization inhibits America's capacity to address its fiscal problems. Republicans insist on spending retrenchment on entitlement and domestic programs as the only route to fiscal salvation, while the Democrats want revenue enhancement to be part of the mix. Both, however, are essential to the achievement of fiscal sustainability. You have got to have spending retrenchment and you've got to have tax increases. Most economists who don't have an ideological bent, either to the left or the right, would agree that. The Republican notion that tax increases of the rich will inhibit growth is not supported by the historical evidence from the 1990s, when the economy grew at a time of increasing taxes, or in the Bush era when the economy declined even though taxes were dramatically reduced. Moreover, the current tax system underwrites the extreme inequality of income that is retarding America's capacity to move from consumption and borrowing to saving and investment. In essence, this income inequality leaves the rich with so much money that they binge on bubble-creating stock market and real estate speculation, and leave the middle class without enough money to buy the things they think they deserve, which leads them to borrow and go into debt. Without a fiscal course correction, America also will not have the public investment funds to spend on programs that will keep it competitive in the future. You've heard how wonderful the American education system is. It is absolutely wonderful. But the parts of it that are wonderful are privatized. What the United States has to do is to remain competitive is to increase its spending on public education, both in schools and in universities. The states patently cannot sustain the level of higher education investment that they've had over the last 50 years. And I'll point to California as a key example. California once had the greatest system of public universities in the world, but it's moving towards semi-privatization through charging high fees that discourage low-income and lower-middle-income applicants. As a result, a recent report by the California state government concluded that the Golden State will have a 1 million graduate shortage by 2025 that will seriously threaten its knowledge-intensive industries. Is America in economic decline? From my point of view, the simple answer is yes. Can it recover at the number one spot? Possible, but highly unlikely. And its strategy for doing so would be mistaken if it attempted to do so. It would be mistaken if it adopted a strategy that tried to block the rise of China. Because China's rise, China may have benefited from the United States, but I can tell you China's economic growth is essential for the world economy and America's economy. The challenge facing the United States, I would argue, is to be a vibrant number two in a revitalized global economy rather than seek to be the top dog in a stagnant one. Sorry to invoke history here, Nick, but as Britain and other European nations have found out, being economic number one is a finite rather than infinite status. Even allowing for American ingenuity, that wonderful ingenuity we've heard so much about, the rest of the developing world is catching up in economic power and technological inventiveness. Therefore, I suggest, to end, it will be a fitting symbol of economic torch passing that we should expect the next Mark Zuckerberg to emerge not in Boston, but in Beijing, Bangalore, or Brasilia. Thank you very much.
historians bearing false historical analysis.
Right, it falls to me to go last. I did a quick summing up today of the number of student essays on the question, is America in decline, that I've marked over the last 2.5 years or so, and it's over 100. And I have to say my level of generosity has been declining quite significantly. And whilst I'm not going to mark the essays that we've heard here this evening, it does strike me that there are some particular strains to this debate that we might draw out as being common. We've just been assaulted by Ewan's indicators. I have no idea what any of these indicators mean.
It means that China's the US is in decline.
Thank you.
America will be a kind of vibrant number 2.
Adam, bless him, resorted to the authority of being a social scientist, which I found bizarre. Both of these arguments, it seems to me, are a defense of Waltzian tautology. They claim decline, properly defined, Adam said. They define power as capabilities, then they pick the indicators that they're going to use to show capabilities to prove the point. At the same time, Mick presented us with a list of caveats and contingencies and underlying strengths and enduring structural realities, which is not an argument that, for me at least, is compelling either. None of this really presents a very compelling case. None of it tells us a great deal about what these indicators, what the future trajectory of the United States means more broadly. And so the question that I want to ask is, why not? What's wrong with this decline debate? And it seems to me that the debate that we're having, and the debate that every student essay I've seen over the last couple of years, is rooted in a set of assumptions about the world that may no longer adequately apply. And that actually, if we rethink how we think about international politics a little, we may come up with some more interesting conclusions, perhaps, as to whether the United States is up or whether the United States is down. So I'm going to just try and draw out some of those theoretical assumptions and suggest some places where we might look for different answers. The assumptions that underpin the rise and fall of great powers are rooted in a set of literature which is called power transition theory. I'm not going to go into it in any detail, it's very, very dull. But essentially this talks about great powers rising and falling in competition for hierarchical position, where, as Ewan talked about, the national economic foundations are the key determinants of military power, which tells us who's up, who's down. Some great powers are revisionist. China wants something else out of the world. Some are status quo and attempts to defend its position in the system in the United States. So power transition theory is a theory about structure. It's a theory about what the arrangement of states is within the system. The nature of the system itself is held constant. Now, when this theory is being developed by Organsky in the 1950s, he actually recognized that systems do change, that systems aren't held constant. He wrote that the pace and extent of industrialization drives shifts in power, but it was not the case before 1750 or so, and it will not always be key in future. And yet, the generations of scholars that followed Organsky forgot this, didn't reinterrogate the system, continued to hold it constant. And so it seems to me that this debate is stuck in a narrative about Cold War realities of the international system. And we should ask ourselves, is that really still true? Is this idea of great powers competing in economic and military ways in an international system that drives them to do so, is this still the reality of international politics? And if the system itself has changed, what does that mean for this debate about the rise or fall of China, Brazil, India, Turkey, and the United States? And it seems to me there are a couple of things that we can say may have changed. Not have changed, but may have changed, and we might think about. The first is great power war. Power transition theory is premised on the basis that you compete militarily, and ultimately you end up in a position of fighting great power war. Well, we are in the longest period of great power peace in history. Nuclear weapons provide us with an incredibly strong deterrent effect to great power war. And I don't think there's anyone here on this table who would seriously argue that any competition between the United States and China is likely to result in general great power war. Secondly, globalization, the dominance of markets, the increase in technological sophistication have, and it's argued, all led to the marginalization of states, not the disappearance of states as Adam characterized it, but the reduction in the centrality of states as the preeminent and primary units in international politics. This debate then may not be about the decline of the United States, but about the decline of the nation state. Perhaps. You don't have to be a card-carrying cosmopolitan to agree with any of this or to judge at least that the halcyon days of great power diplomacy may have passed. And I think third, and probably most importantly, is the shift that material power, material dominance, Ewan spoke so eloquently about, Adam as well, no longer, if they ever have, equates to the production of hegemony and international leadership. The question of who leads, whose ideas matter, who drives the zeitgeist of international politics is not directly related to the number of tanks you have or the amount of money in your banks. And this leads us to the question that if it's not about material power, if it's not solely about material power, what's the point of and in a decline debate? If we can't count the things that we're supposed to be adding up to see what's up and what's down, what's the point in even having an excellent event of an evening?
Who signed you over?
Well, I think in many ways what's more important than a debate about American decline is the debate about what Francis Fukuyama recently, in a rejoinder piece, he's still dining out on this title, wrote about the future of history. And this is a question about, in the wake of a financial crisis, in the wake of some major wars and some major senses of asymmetry and shifts in conflict in international politics, it's a question about who starts telling the best story. This was, I think, the Indian foreign minister's question. Who tells the best story? It's not about who has the most power, but who tells the best story. Who has the vision of human progress? Who answers the contemporary problems of society, of economics and politics? Now, I wouldn't argue that the United States is supplying the answers on these questions. I don't think China is either. I don't think India is. I don't think Turkey is. And I certainly don't think Europe is. But I would argue that the United States, perhaps more than any other society at the moment, is starting to engage with the fundamentals of this debate about the Tea Party. Is radical libertarianism the way forward for our societies? Or nationalism and protectionism and aggressive protection of our industries and our workforces? The Buffett rule. Is it the renewal of the middle class in the face of ever-increasing concentrations of wealth? Is it about the Occupy movement? The rejection of established structures of neoclassical economics, wholesale? Even, we'll see, I think, in the upcoming presidential election, whether, as much as anything else, there's a wholesale questioning of modern Western democratic politics that are seen to be failing or have failed. Now, we don't know the outcome of this debate, it seems to me. There are a lot of people out there saying, well, we know the overall context of the problems. This is a very easy thing to say. But there's not a lot of clear answers. But I would argue that the fact that a genuine debate about really global futures is taking place strongly within the United States is an encouraging sign. So we do know, in a sense, that this debate is not so much about the decline of the United States in the international system, the position of one state or another relative to others. This debate is actually much bigger than that, much more important than that. It's about the nature and future of the system itself and how, in the coming years, that will be redefined. And I would argue, at least, that the redefinition of that system, the ideas that will redefine that system, are more likely than anywhere else to emanate from the United States. That's what I believe.
Okay, we're just going to have Adam speak for 2 minutes to sum up.
Okay.
And then me.
Here, yeah.
Okay,
Well, what fun. I think that what we've had the warning that one should beware historians bearing analogies. I think the counterpart of that has to always be beware IR scholars picking their history to suit their arguments. I think that there are two analogies possibly at work here. One is the analogy that says that all great powers of the past have at some point gone into a period of decline, and the other is the analogy that says 20 years ago someone was wrong about American decline, therefore everyone who ever says America will decline ever again is wrong too. I think analogy number one is probably the one that I am more convinced by. Ask yourselves, I suppose, well, two things. First of all, about the importance of the debate, and then some of the things you should think about. All politics, it has been said, and I rather agree with this, being a realist, is about answering two basic questions. Who gets what, and says who? And I think the answer to that question in the world today is that China gets more, and in combination with that, China gets more say. And in the world of zero-sum politics, where one person having more say has inevitably to mean someone else having less, that means that the United States' relative position is going to be declining. Does China admire the United States? Does China like the United States system? Yes, it does, in the same way as a middle manager admires his boss's office. This is a genuine affection for the role that that the United States plays in the system. Does it want to provoke a war with some kind of precipitate head-on Germany-style run to take over the system? Obviously not. It's very sensibly, quietly rising, as they used to call it before they thought Batman was scary, even, and changed it to peacefully moving in a non-threatening direction or something, which I imagine is the new system. The underlying facts remain the same. The United States is dealing with a country which is going to have more of an economic share of the pie, more military resources on the basis of that, and all of the things that go hand in hand with those two things will come in combination with it. Ask yourselves the following questions. The United States still has lots of advantages in the world today, yes. More top 100 universities, more companies in the list of all the biggest companies in the world, more scientific breakthroughs, and more prizes for them. But in 20 years' time, do you really believe that China is going to have fewer or the same number of those things, or do you think it's going to have rather more? I would suggest that it's going to have rather more, and if you believe that, then you believe in the relative decline of the United States. Second of all, merely to keep the current levels of advantage, the United States needs to savagely, and I mean savagely, cut its spending on things like healthcare, things like social security. You thought you had a pension? Sorry, you don't have a pension. You're sick and you need help? Too bad, so sad. And devote all of the money that's taking away from those things simply to running faster and keeping up with China in terms of geopolitical security. Do the American people and the politicians who pander to the American people have the stomach for that agenda? If you think the answer is no, then the United States is going to be in relative decline over the course of the years to come. Finally, the United States may well have a number of structural advantages through the current system. Because it's been richer for a longer time, because it's had military institutions, because it's had political institutions of its own making, in which it has operated in a leadership role for some time, the United States is obviously able to set the agenda, set the terms of the debate in a way that other powers do not. But ask yourself this: as another power comes to have a bigger economy, as another power comes to have the same or greater level of military power in the world, is it likely to leave a structure of that kind totally untouched, still dominated by the American capacity to set the agenda, or is it going to very reasonably, possibly very steadily, politely but firmly, going to ask that the system should move to accommodate its own newly risen status? And if you believe that it is, then your only conclusion can be that the United States is going to be in relative decline compared to it. In politics, what matters is who gets what. And you can only have your share, to some degree, meaningful in comparison to the share that somebody else has. Relative decline is the only kind of decline that there is that's worth talking about. I don't even know what absolute decline means. And therefore, I would submit to you that by all the measures available, by all the trends available, and by any belief system that says that the measures and trends we have are the ones on which we should make judgments, there is only one conclusion for you to reach here today. The world of the future may be peaceful, the world of the future may be happy, the world of the future may be based upon collaboration by men and nations, but that will be a world in which the United States is no longer the preeminently powerful nation that it has been relative to others. Thank you very much.
Okay, I won't bother with notes. Waste of time. First of all, I thought that Nick would be on my side. It's like having Drogba playing for Arsenal. Facts matter, Nick. Facts matter. And I cited a lot of facts because I think they matter. I think it matters that the United States economy, as even Ewan recognised, is still something close to 22-25% of the world economy. And that hasn't changed dramatically over a long period of time. I think it matters that the dollar is still the most important international currency in the world today. If you print other people's world currency, that gives you a lot of structural power. If you can run the deficits, the trade deficits the United States runs, that's a sign not of weakness, it seems to me, but of quite a lot of market power. When China is exporting 8-9% of its economy to the United States every year, that gives the United States a hell of a lot of leverage. Run to safety, that's what everyone talks about today. Where do they run to? Where are you going to run to? You know? This tells you something about the United States. the moment they're not running to the Eurozone. There's very little investment. There's very little investment in Greece. Russia is not a safe bet, unless you happen to have a lot of bodyguards. In a moment of crisis, all the economic indicators are given. They're running to the United States. They're running to the dollar. People invest where they think it's safe to do so, and where they think it's safest to do so in the midst of this economic storm, which is at the moment engulfing the Eurozone and indeed Europe. They're running to the United States, and that tells you something. That still tells you a hell of a lot. These are the boring facts, Nick, which tell us quite a lot. On the military power side, I'm obviously boring, and in the old school of, how many tanks you have actually does make a difference. How many soldiers you have makes a difference. How many warheads you make. I mean, we counted them throughout the whole of the damn Cold War. It makes a difference. When the Chinese have now got their one aircraft carrier, I said, well done. You've taken 10 years to renovate a clapped out old piece of Soviet junk for a vast amount of money, and you've got one aircraft carrier. Well done. The United States, by the way, has 11 aircraft carrier groups which patrol the waters of the world today.
Come back in 10 years, mate.
Well, yeah. Get real. I think the Chinese are, as you indeed indicated, they themselves know that an extended arms race with the United States is A, not in their interest, B, is not one they're going to win, and fundamentally will completely transform their relationship with the United States, which has given them so much benefit over the last 10 years. They are not seriously balancing the United States in the genuine sense of balancing. And that's what we've got to account for. And that actually is a mark of huge respect for the power of the United States, whether it's economic, structural, regional, cultural, soft power, or hard power. And I think these are just basic elements to take into any consideration of an analysis whether you think the international system is changing in fundamentals. It is important, by the way, on the higher education thing, and I take this not because I've been teaching in institutions of higher education for the last 40 years, and indeed have had the privilege to do so. What a great job, actually. Paid to read books and occasionally write a few. This is the best job in the world. I'm one of these very few academics who actually think it's great to be an academic. And anyway, who's going to listen to a moaning academic? Pathetic group of people. But higher education, I take Ewan's point about privatisation. I think there is a real issue there. You do touch on that. The spread of this is bad in America. There's no question about that. Well, by the way, it's not quite so bad down at some of the state college levels, by the way. I think you slightly overstated that. That's some great state institutions throughout the United States, which still do a pretty damn good job. But these rankings, however imperfect they may well be, still tell us something. It tells us something about cultural power, cultural wealth, where people think knowledge is based, where knowledge is coming from. And who is generating that? You talked about patents, by the way. That's not an indicator. The best indicator is actually top-cited research in the world in science and engineering. If you want to just take it outside the social sciences and humanities. If you look at that indicator, rather than the number of patents, what you see is something very important and something very striking. How many of the top research cited articles in the world today in science and technology, and also, by the way, in international relations and in political science, and the top-rated journals in the world today, you may not like it, still happen to come from the US of A. And there's got to be some reasons for that, which tell us something about some of the enduring strengths and vitalities of the American system. Does the United States have the structural problems that you and I think correctly point to? Undoubtedly. Undoubtedly. Inequalities, deindustrialization of the North. Detroit, one of the great American cities which produced some of the greatest music of the 20th century, Tamla Motown. To see the decline of Detroit is sad and tragic. There is no doubt. But the numbers of people in prison today in America, particularly from ethnic minorities and working class communities, is a blight and tells us a lot that is wrong about America. I take all this on board. I'm not an apologist for everything American or the American capitalist order and all this. People who know me know I wouldn't say that. My only thing is the way you painted America, it sounded like the United Kingdom in the 1970s. without the trade unions, so to speak. I mean, clearly there are structural problems here, but yet it moves, yet it can be reformed. And the capacity of America for renovation, it still strikes me, is really quite striking. Let us just make one just simple observation by way of conclusion in terms of renovation. Many people won't agree with this point, but it makes my general point like this. 8 years of GW, not my favourite president, as you know. What happens at the end of that process? Barack Obama. Now, I know there are a lot of criticism of Barack Obama, by the way, increasingly from his supporters, and certainly from the Republicans. But it does tell you something about the regenerative capacity of the United States at the political level. And I think what is true at the political level, in spite of all the stoppages in the system, the gridlock that people with, does tell you something. It does tell you something about the strength of America and its capacity for renovation, for rethinking itself. And I think that again suggests that whatever problems it has, and they've been well talked about, even by my supporter, it seems to me its strengths still outweigh its weaknesses, and maybe for the next 20, 25 years, I don't know, I never make predictions, I think the United States won't be this number two, a vibrant number two. I think it will still be an important part of the international system at number one. Thank you very much.
So, this is the time for...
Oh, I thought you were going to speak on my behalf.
Yeah. This is the time for you guys to participate. I was going to say we've had two sides. Perhaps we've had three sides. What we'll do is one question at a time, and then if you could direct... first of all, if you could say who you are, and then if you could direct it to the individual, that would be great. Please.
It's a question to the board. I agree with you, Mick, that it was hard to tell whose case Nick was arguing, but Nick did bring up, I think, possibly the most interesting point of the evening, and that was questioning the debate itself. If it wasn't time for a whole new debate, rather than the decline or not decline, did we not need an entirely new debate? And I would put that to anybody in the board. Do they agree with that, first of all? And secondly, could they suggest what that debate might be?
Yeah.
I'll have a go. I mean, it's a debate I'm very happy to have, I think, which is, I mean, what Nick's getting at is that perhaps we need to move beyond considering whether or not relative measures of nation-states' power, measured in terms of their economic size and their military capacity, are an important thing worth having in favour of a discussion of something else. And my contribution to that debate is to say, no, I think that it's enormously important that we continue to talk about nation-states and their relative economic size and the military capacity that they have at their disposal, because frankly, while it may not be everything in the world, it never has been everything. Many of the ideas of the importance of non-state actors and the importance of transnational phenomena in various forms have been around for a very long time, and if they were crowded out by discussion of nation-states and their relative size and power completely, then I would say that would be a travesty. But on the countervailing point, in terms of what really matters in especially crisis situations in the world, if you need the stability provided, the military peace provided in which most of the other phenomena of the world unfold, if you have an economic crisis that touches on fundamental questions of value and resource distribution and you need something to backstop the global economy in the way that has been necessary in the last couple of years, the nation-state is still very much where you look for that kind of thing. And in terms of seeing what a world order looks like, the most powerful nation-state in the world is still a question you want to answer in order to understand it. Is a world that is run by the United States qualitatively different in some ways from a world that is run by some other nation-state? I would suggest that it probably is, and therefore, knowing that the United States or some other power is relatively the wealthiest and has relatively the greatest capacity, is still an important thing to know about the world. There are other important things to know too, but I think I would defend to the death the idea that part of what we do is usefully concerning ourselves with that question.
I agree with Adam. I would also add something else which Nick said. Who tells the best story? He also raised that, which is an interesting point. Well, that is an important question. Who tells the best story about themselves? And the American story now isn't quite the great same story it once was. That I do accept. That I would concede. But who else tells any story? The European Union sadly does not at the moment, and I say that as somebody who is very much in favour of the European project. What is China's story? Well, it's an attractive story for some people. There's no question. Authoritarian capitalism, if you wish, that is a story. Is it a long-term story? I don't think so, and I certainly hope not. I certainly hope not. The story, however, still, even in China, and this is what I find remarkable about China and India and South Korea and Taiwan and Japan and Australia and Canada and most of South America and large parts of Africa, the story that is being told largely, it may not be an American story in the sense that it once was, the age of Henry Lewis. But the story that is being told it seems to me, is twofold and important, and does come back to the United States. One is that in some fundamental sense there is only there's only one basic economic story out there. And that story is what kind of market you have. It's a capitalistic story largely now. It isn't like the 30s, the 40s, the 50s and the 60s. That has changed. That does change the nature of the system which you were talking about, Nick. And largely, many of the values that the Chinese are buying into, and India, and all the other countries, they may not be purely American values in a classical, simple, straightforward sense, but they're basically, it's a story about consumerism, bourgeois acquisitiveness, profit, etc., etc., etc. That is what people are buying into. Now, that is a very American story, it seems to me. That is a very American story. It may not be told today with such confidence. It may not be told after the crisis with that degree of bravado and hubris which was there in the 1990s. I accept that. But it is still the story that's being told. Go to Shanghai, go to Hong Kong, go to any of these 20 Chinese cities which will have 20 million citizens. They're looking to the United States. That's the story they want to hear about. Go to India. That's the story they want to hear about. Large parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Huge admiration for the United States. And by the way, even before Barack Obama. So that's the story. It isn't a straightforward, America is great, America is the best, America is the only. I accept that. But I think that is the large story being told in the world today.
Mick, first of all, I'm sorry for not supporting you.
Yeah, I was a bit sorry. I'm 3 against 1. That's okay, I can carry it. My shoulders are big.
I didn't realise such a giant of the profession was in need of my support, I have to say. In terms of this, in terms of the debate, first of all, there's this problem, I think, in the debate, in the automatic relationship between capabilities and indicators, which in many ways, as we've seen across the panel, are totally incommensurable. We can't weigh them against each other. And what we mean by power. We simply don't have means as social scientists, as good social scientists, of coming up with ways of thinking properly about what states can achieve in the world before they actually achieve it. And in many ways, we see this from the fact that we overestimated the power of the United States so much through the 1990s. Because as the United States didn't do as much as it did after 9/11, we were fooled into thinking here was an omnipotent empire. And of course, the reality is that the United States has not been a particularly powerful, great power throughout the 20th century. It had disastrous problems in Vietnam through the 1970s. I think, secondly, is this association of the system with the states that make it. That somehow, because the United States had this moment of institution building in 1945, that therefore this is an American system, that the system should be thought about in terms of the United States. Well, the reality is that, yes, there are some American things that make up the system, but a lot of the things that make up the system are totally exogenous to nation states. And that will remain no matter which states get to make up those elements of the system that can be defined by states. And this is the issue, the story. And I think Mick's absolutely right. The basic story is accepted. And it is a basic story that in many ways is American, or at least corresponds with American principles, American ideas, and the American story, if you like. But the specifics are up for discussion. We are in a moment of debate about what that story is. The Washington consensus, the neoliberal consensus, is over. Nobody knows what to replace it with yet. I would argue that China's idea about what to replace it with is almost non-existent. And I think the ideas of what to replace it with will come from the United States and Western Europe, from the West. But it is, I think, that story is the crucial element here, not whether the United States somehow has the range of power capabilities to keep it number one on top. I don't think those kind of categories and understandings really make a lot of sense.
Well, I don't think I could really contribute to what's coming next. All I can say as a historian is what's been before, and listen to, with great respect, which we don't want to insult you. We've had this debate about great powers, and suddenly, because we're not getting the right outcome, hey, let's have a different debate. Let's talk about the chamber system. Well, I'm sorry, this is a system we've got. I cannot foresee change in the medium term future. For the moment, I think we're going to be talking about states and their relative power, and the reality is that the United States, to me, and I regret to say this because I am very pro-American, is in relative decline, but I'll leave it there.
Take a few. Take a few. Yeah.
So was it me? Yes.
Yeah.
I understand this is a bit hard. Talking through your head, I apologise. My name is Grant. I'm an ISA alumna of a few years back. When I was listening to this question, sort of is really for Nick and possibly Ewan, really. It seems to me that there's this sort of talk about the attractiveness of two systems. One is predominantly a US driven capitalistic system, maybe coming out of the British Empire, that kind of thing. And the other one is this authoritarian capitalism of China. What Ewan was saying about the decline of American power because of economics can have a social impact. If America declines even more socially, it becomes a less passive place, a more violent environment, it becomes less attractive as a place for people to want to go to and to emulate. So this economic red light flashing will impact upon the attractiveness of the US. I'm wondering if you agree with that, of the US's attractiveness to other countries, to be like it, to emulate it, its soft power, etc., etc. If it economically fails, why would you want to follow a failure? And the question that Nick was talking about whether we need to really look at the system, I think that's actually really, really important. From my point of view, we have authoritarian capitalism, we have old capitalism, and what we really need is a neo-capitalism, a new form of capitalism which is more humane and more ethical. And that is what a lot of people around the world, and it's not getting as much coverage as it should do, that's what people are talking about, this new form of capitalism. And it might be that the country that has the most vision to do this is the US, because they are the most inventive. So I wouldn't say they're in decline, I'm saying that they might be, and what do you think what I just said?
Take one. Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Phil Mullen. I've also got a question about the nature of the debate, particularly the longevity of the debate, which both sides have mentioned sometimes in terms of sustaining their argument. Right, this is a debate that's gone on for 40 years or so. Why has it gone on for so long? And I think if we were to spend a bit more time asking that question and trying to resolve it, it would actually perhaps lead us towards the resolution of the debate. Because I think it's gone on for so long, the obvious answer is because of America's great ability to be able to manage its decline. It has been remarkably resilient. The debate's gone on because every year there's indicators of economic problems in America, but it has proved very, very capable at managing those problems, taking advantage of the end of the Cold War, for example, in a way which no one else was able to do. So the question really then becomes, not is America in decline, but to what extent are its powers of resilience or renovation as strong as they have been over those 40 years? I must admit, Nick, I think your point about the state of American politics today indicating the strength of American renovative powers doesn't quite chime with me if you look at political paralysis in the American elite today. To me, to conclude, but I mean, I think the key point here, and it relates to Ewan's points, is that the basis of that resilience has been, whether I like it or not, borrowing by America from abroad. Right? That the borrowing, which has been growing year after year after year since the mid-80s, has sustained its ability to renovate and to be resilient. And it seems to me there must be limits to that ability to continue to borrow and borrow and borrow, not least given that China is the one who's been the banker to that borrowing. So the question is, does one see any limits to the historic resilience and capability of America to be able to sustain and manage its decline?
Thank you. One more? Brian?
Yes. I'm Brian Claxton from next door at the IHR, and I should preface this comment by saying that I'm not American. I'm actually a British-born Canadian back here living back here in Britain. There is one fundamental advantage that America has that hasn't been mentioned by Nick, and it's so pervasive that we don't even really see it, but I'm using it at the moment, and it's the English language. And Nick put his finger on the importance of the story and the American story, but it seems to me that that advantage is irreversible in the future, because Chinese people and their children are coming here to learn English, and they're learning English in China. But it just seems to me that that is a key advantage that can't really be quantified. And I think that we perhaps underestimate that. I have no idea how it's going to pan out in the 21st century, but I suspect that with the growth of the media and the internet and all the rest of it, it will become an increasingly important advantage that the message, the story, the ideas, the ideals of America can be projected more quickly and easily than those of any other country, those of any other language group, for that simple reason. I don't think we've really taken that into account here. And I'm not the expert to comment on that. Oh, if I could just add one quick point. I was mystified by Adam's emphasis on the importance of military power. I thought that the most important point that Nick made was that the system is changing, and the importance of military power within the system is declining. And that, I think, speaking of relative decline and decline in general, the most important decline, I think, is the relative decline of military power, the importance of military power. One thing we didn't mention is that...
Can we just...
Yeah,
sorry.
I'll make this point very quickly.
Very quick.
The reason why Japan and Germany rose so strongly in the second half of the 20th century was because they couldn't spend on the military. And the reason why the Soviet Union collapsed so quickly was because it spent so much on the military. And I think that America could very easily emulate Japan and Germany in its rise by forgetting about military spending and studying in schools and hospitals and social
Okay, I'll take it. Well, I suppose the United States, the American dream. Nobody's mentioned that tonight, but other than American Decline, if you want to write a bestseller, write it on the end of the American dream. We forget. We have this vision. Nick referred to the really pathological elements of it. The American middle class is in really bad trouble. I mean, the share of national wealth taken by the very rich has increased dramatically over the last 25 years. Now, same thing is happening in Europe, but we don't count, okay? But in the United States, the maldistribution of wealth has incredibly serious social and economic consequences. Economic in the sense that if this is a nation which has built its well-being on consumption, and that wealth isn't being created to provide a sufficiently broad band of consumption. The only way you fund consumption is borrowing, and you're back into this problem again. So maldistribution of wealth is a terrible problem. Secondly, and here I will quote Larry Summers, one-time provost of Harvard and Treasury Secretary and various other things as my authority. It is unprecedented that the world's greatest power is also its greatest borrower. And you might say, you know, Patrick, Nick, we got sticky power here. Who was the guy who said, you know, they're never going to let the United States go because the United States, they've got to support the United States, the Chinese, because America went down, they go down with them. Yes and no. The Chinese can do one thing, and they can hurt the Americans a lot. They continue to loan to the United States, but they loan for much shorter periods. Instead of loaning for 10 years or 5 years, they make 1 year bonds. And buying 1 year bonds give them the opportunity. They're already diversifying. Yes, they are America's largest creditor, but they're already diversifying into other currencies. Yes, the dollar is the greatest reserve currency, but you can buy plenty of other currencies from the Swiss franc, sterling, whatever. And the last point on the American economy. You know, you have got this unprecedented problem of the fiscal debt. Mick mentioned Greece. America, in fiscal terms, will be very much like Greece within 20 years, except for one thing, that they'll be able to borrow more. But borrowing just creates, just adds to the problem. The United States has got to solve this. Where's the political will? Political will depends on compromise and conciliation. And we don't see that yet. And I regret to say that whoever wins the 2012, unless the Republicans get a complete clean sweep, win the presidency, win the Senate, win the House, and then come in and say, right, we're taking it all away. The end of the New Deal set. And that'll be it. That's one way of doing it, but at considerable cost, I suspect. And not many people want to live in the United States then, I fear.
When were you last in Greece, by the way?
We're not talking about Greece, we're talking about America, okay? Yeah. And on the English language, hey, we invented it, and it didn't do us much good. Well, you invented
it. Okay. On the issue of models, I guess, you sort of reminded me of a book Robert Kagan wrote back in 2007, I think, called The Return of History and the End of Dreams, when he told us that the great autocracies of Russia and China were coming back with a model that would rule the world. And, you know, Russia looks to me like a mafia basket case. And China, you know, the Beijing consensus is a fiction of Western commentators. You know, Beijing doesn't think it has a consensus or a model to offer the world. But you're right. This notion of attractiveness, can the United States be attractive when it is representative of a profound failure of its capitalist model?
Bullshit. Sorry. Was that a question?
But I think what's interesting is that the rejection of American capitalism is most profoundly being done in the United States. The calls for a new kind of capitalism are more socially sensitive form of capitalism, a form of capitalism that actually, as Ewan mentioned, starts to look after middle classes, which are in real problems around the world. That is coming from the United States. You know, Occupy Wall Street has spawned Occupy movements in 82 different countries. This is the most significant anti-government protest in the United States since the Vietnam War. And so I think Mick's point about reinvention, it says something, I think, quite strong about the American political system, that this kind of reinvention thinking is going on. Last thing, just quickly, on this question of military power and the utility of military power. I'm delighted to see the United States cutting its defence budgets. I'm not sure the United States yet has adequately thought through how to spend its defence budget for the kind of military operations that may need to be undertaken in a world without great power. It's still planning to fight major wars, to hold one and win one major wars. It's not planning for counterinsurgency operations on a small scale, on military policing scale, or cyber war in the way it should be. And the danger, it seems to me, for the United States is actually the embedded militarism that has come to characterize a large amount of American society, built up through the Cold War, I think, which Andrew Basovich talks about quite profoundly. I think that is more of a danger to America's ability to reinvent the way it spends its money for whatever the great power competition might be in a post-great power war system.
Okay, I won't try and answer every single question in detail. One question is, why has the American debate about decline gone on for so long? Well, the debate about Ottoman decline went on for 400 years, so this is pretty youthful. The debate about British decline, I think, started about 1898, and they were still talking about it before Mrs. Thatcher came into power, and of course reversed British decline, or so I'm told. So it has gone on, and I suppose all great powers, in a sense, will reflect back on themselves all the time. It's the nature. It's the nature of the beast to do that. I mean, Luxembourg presumably does not have reflections upon whether it's in decline or not, and the same is presumably true of Liechtenstein, and France, of course, has got over that many years ago. But it's an interesting question as to why the debate has gone on, and now you give one explanation of that, which I think is very interesting. It could well be that, in a sense, part of the reason for that debate going on is people like us. There could be a sociology of intellectuals here in which we love talking about decline, because in essence, we're kind of intellectually miserabilist. Meet an intellectual and you'll never meet an optimist. And I think for many intellectuals, actually, America's a problem because it's based on optimism. And I think there's a kind of a culture clash, dare I even call it a clash of civilizations, between what intellectuals love talking about, which is decline and crisis and miserable things, and what America is. Because every time you go to the United States, it's quite true, the middle class are suffering badly, and there's some very tough situations in the United States. There always have been, by the way. It's not entirely here. But you are met with this kind of optimism. And that optimism does reflect something material. It's something deeply embedded and hardwired into what I call American cultural politics. I wouldn't call it psychology, but I think it's important. I mean, it's a futuristic, optimistic society. And I still think that is this sense of resilience, which makes it not Europe.
It still believes in individual freedom.
Thank you very much for that clarification. Yes, it believes in that as well. So my point really here is that there's a kind of... when I said about Obama, I wasn't... Of course there's gridlock in Congress. I mean, in a sense, the founding fathers made it a gridlock system. It was designed for gridlock. It's called a balance of power. The federal system is a gridlock system. They kind of built it into the original structure. And one therefore shouldn't be so surprised, when it does what it's supposed to do, which is check the executive power. And in a sense, that's what Congress is designed to do. Yet it moves. Yet it gets things done. Yet it moves forward in ways. And coming out of this crisis, and it's still in it in many, many ways, and certainly some parts of the deindustrializing North are still in it. Still, traveling around, you still feel a massive amount of energy, future-oriented thinking about where, in time, you'll get over this. There's a lot of misery at the moment. There's more pessimism now than I've met for a long time. That is for sure. But underlying it all, there use the term American dream, but I mean, even if you don't use that term, there is a kind of hardwired sense that the future is ultimately going to get better. And we'll get out of this. And after all, we can produce iPhones, and we can produce the Bill Gateses of this world, and we could use Facebook, and we can do all that. We do have these great universities, private or otherwise. All of that is going to take us forward. And anyway, it'll still remain an extraordinarily stable society by any measure. I mean, you know, you talk about the campaigns against capitalism in the United States. They don't fundamentally threaten this kind of stability of the system. They challenge some assumptions about the system and the vast inequalities of wealth, which you correctly draw your attention to. The middle class is not doing well. Vast inequalities over the last 20 years have raised huge problems, not just in the United States, but throughout the whole of the capitalist world. And I think that is something that really genuinely does need to be addressed, and I take that point on board. On the question of China, again, it's come up time and time again. Look, I'm going to be I am the expert on China. I go there twice a year and I don't speak Chinese. Therefore, I become an expert on China. All I can go is along with what, forget the statistics, it's just talking to people and, interestingly, talking to the Chinese elite themselves and the business class, the people who have made vast amounts of money, who buy 30% of the top 5 crews coming out of Bordeaux, who are buying German cars and keeping the German economy alive, who are buying Australian raw materials and keeping Australia buoyant. You know, these are the new super rich. Now it's quite interesting, a ruling class, if you like, the real ruling class. Many of the members of the Communist Party, in fact, you now can't join the Communist Party without being a capitalist. It's an interesting phenomenon. Where do they look? And that's my point. Where do they look? They are well aware of China, of its flaws, whatever the great achievements of the Chinese economy clearly have been. And I'm not running those down. Where do they want to go and live? This is an interesting question. How do they want to live? What you're finding is that many of them are trying to get their money out. They're trying to buy lots of property around in other parts of the world because basically they find life more interesting, more diverse, its newspapers worth reading, its bookstores worth going in, its films worth watching in other parts of the world. And by the way, one other part of the world it finds this very, very interestingly important place to go is the United States. And indeed, by the way, also London. You know, where the rich want to be does tell you something about where they think the world is still the future. And they don't see it to the extent that I think they would if China was this rising power in the way that it's a new civilization on the march. I'm just very, very sceptical about that. On the point, finally, on linguistic power, I mean, it's a difficult one to work on, but I take your point. I take your point. Linguistic power, is, you know, what language people want to speak is important. I mean, the French know that very, very well. And in some senses know they've lost the battle. They have lost that battle, for good or ill. I'm not going to make any judgments on that. In the old days of the 1980s, or the 70s, we learned Russian. I tried to very poorly, very badly. Why do we learn it? Partly to know the enemy, but partly because we thought it was an important thing to know about. In other words, you do learn the languages which you do think reflect something important about the future. And in that sense, and in that regard, therefore, the numbers of people now, you know, learning English in China, indeed around the world, and indeed in former Eastern European countries too, is very important. The second language always used to be Russian. Then it used to be for a while German. Now, of course, it is English. Now, equally, one also has to say, and this does actually tell to Alan's point. And I will finish on this point. I just finished point. There are a number of people in the world today who are learning Mandarin. More people want to learn Mandarin. That's for sure. In Australia, this is for sure. And that does tell us something, which
and
is...
the United States.
And in the United States, without question. But still, the dominant lingua franca is going to remain English. And I think that does tell us something about... I could say other things about relative decline of military power. I don't believe it. I think military power is still essential to the determination of international politics now and in the future as it has been in the past. And the fact that the United States has vast quantities of this, globally deployed, forwardly deployed in all parts of the world, still says a lot about the balance of power in the world today.
Thank you very much. Well,
it's all right.
4 things. Oh, thank you him. But
I
thank you too. I'll thank you too if you like. Wait till afterwards, though. 4 things, I guess I want to say. First of all, I'm not sure that I'm convinced that societies are hardwired to be optimistic or pessimistic. I think that societies go through phases of being that. But if you look at British society in the Victorian era, for example, the kind of thoroughly embedded discourses they had about the purpose of the nation, its glorious future stretching over an indefinite horizon, the boundless possibilities of empire, the optimism of a very similar sort of sense that they had about where they were going. And then as they entered into the 20th century, E.H. Carr's lament that they were turning into a pessimistic, inward-looking, decline-oriented society. I think the United States has been judged to have these qualities during a period when the United States had much to be optimistic about, I would suggest, whereas I think it's perfectly possible, I'm not guaranteeing it, but it's perfectly possible that this optimistic quality may well, if sustained by challenges of the sort that seem to be arraying themselves before it, that it may be dented and prove to be, if resilient, then at least certainly not hardwired into the DNA. I can imagine an America that is not as optimistic as the one that we currently have, while still being America. The second thing I want to say is about military security. I think military security and military superiority are a lot like oxygen. You don't tend to notice you need them until a shortage crops up. Yes, indeed. And I think my response to anybody who says to me, I don't think military power matters, is a bit like my response to somebody who says money doesn't matter. Well, I say, I'll have yours then, please. I think it's extremely unwise to imagine that if you remove a level of military advantage that has provided a freedom of action of almost unprecedented scale from a nation, that it will be able to continue to behave in the same way. Why is the Chinese government, when presumably it could do other things with the money, so keen to acquire military capacity if it doesn't matter? Why are other countries in that part of the world rearranging their own military investments accordingly? Why is the United States making new military commitments to that part of the world? And why is the European Union, of course, famously taken much less seriously than its economic size and cultural importance would seem to suggest it should be? Because it lacks a military wing to back all of that up. Germany and Japan are what they are in terms of their policies because they were defeated in a war by a power which then subsequently provided them with the military security that they needed because it didn't want them arming themselves. Absent the United States being similarly defeated and occupied by that power that basically removes that aspect of their sovereignty, I can't imagine in a million years that it would be seen as an aspirational thing by America or indeed any other nation state that it should actively give up autonomy with regard to military security. So I think, as you may have guessed from the tone of my remarks throughout the course of the evening, military security seems unimportant when it isn't actually under challenge, but is actually so fundamental that nothing could be more important. If not always at the front of the agenda, it's always underlying it. For other things to be important, it must be there as a precursor. The third thing that I wanted to say was simply about the longevity of the debate. It certainly it adds an element of comedy in some ways to these conversations. The fact that we have gone round in circles so many times, and the phrase that a stop clock is right twice a day is always hanging over my head, in the sense that even if I am right, people will just say that, well, if you say the same thing constantly, it will crop up. But I would say that the reason why it has recurred so much is because the United States has stubbornly failed thus far to decline, and therefore those who wish to assert that if it did, it only has to decline once, and then I presume we will stop talking about it historically. So it is its resilience that makes it a recurrent debate. And I think also, at present, I don't subscribe to the full Paul Kennedy overstretch theory, because that theory basically says that the resources simply do not exist for you to sustain your commitments abroad. The United States is not in that position. The position that it is in, however, is where it faces an unavoidable choice about whether or not to steer resources away from what it's said that it wants to do in terms of its domestic priorities and put them into sustaining its superiority in geopolitical terms. That is potentially something that if society mobilized and cohered around that agenda, it could do. I am profoundly skeptical about whether that's a saleable proposition within US politics. And diagnosing the fact that the reason it's going to decline is that it has a dysfunctional political system that can't produce solutions of that sort is a diagnosis of why it will decline. But some people see it as an explanation of why it won't in some ways. But, the problems lie within, therefore the solutions lie within, therefore they will obviously occur. I think internal problems and inability to solve your problems is at least as crippling a problem as an external constraint in some ways. And the fact that I can't see past some of the divides they have is no reason. It means that the domestic source of some of their issues there is not a reason for optimism. The final point I wanted to make, I know this isn't a debate about China, but it is obviously something that's become very relevant. the United States spent a huge proportion of its time, as it became more wealthy and more powerful, believing and insisting that it did not want to interfere in other people's business, that it certainly didn't want to be a hegemonic power in the world, that other powers' sovereignty, that they're not being interfered with, and that America being left essentially to itself, was a big part of their worldview. Events subsequently, of course, conspired to mean that the United States, because it became more powerful, because it had the resources to do it, and then changes in the international order invited it to do so, became very ideologically different. It changed its perspective over a period of time to embrace this hegemonic, liberally embedded conception of world order, which has been the basis of its world role since. Therefore, when people point to the way China is now, refusing to adopt broader responsibilities for the international system, having a very sovereignty-oriented view of how you relate to other people, and say, well, now once China is risen, these ideas will unproblematically continue to be its ideas, which either means that it's being irresponsible or means we can relax depending on how you view it. I say be careful. Fareed Zakaria wrote that well-known book, From Wealth to Power, about the idea that as countries get richer and as their definition of their national interest expands, their view on precisely these sorts of questions tends to change. So looking for China to be an interventionist power with a global ideology that answers other people's solutions and has a hegemonic worldview now is putting the cart before the horse. Let's come back in a couple of decades, because the United States didn't tour the world spreading its hegemonic ideology and then get the wealth and power to back it up. It got one first and then the latter came. I think it's not certain, I don't want to be a determinist, but it's at the very least plausible to me that that's the direction in which things could go. So watch this space would be my advice when it comes to the idea that China doesn't have any of the ideas that would be required to play the hegemonic role in the international system. Those are my 4 points. Thank you very much.
If we'll have 3 more questions and then... Oh, we'll do the vote then.
Yeah, let's do the vote. Come on.
So we'll do the vote. So I'm assuming that the question will be all those who believe that the US is in decline, please raise their hands. And this is just for democratic purposes. And for those people, so it's about halfish, and for those people that believe that the US is not in decline, please raise their hands.
Yeah! Go USA!
Within a deviation of a kind of a draw. I suppose in these situations it's the chair that gets the final vote.
No! Declinists go home early.
Yeah. So, without further ado,
think about what the evening's going to have.
I'd like to thank you so much. This has been a great discussion. Thank you very much, all 4 of you. Thank you for you guys as well participating. So please, if we could all give all of ourselves a round of applause.